This is key issue 4. Why do states cooperate and compete with each other? We are looking at political geography, chapter 8. Supranationalism is when three or more countries form an organization. So this is not just a partnership, that would be between two states, but if it gets to three or more, that is a supranational organization. So here are the most common or well-known organizations. The United Nations has a lot of countries. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance led by the United States. The EU is the European Union. Again, that is a political and economic partnership, or I should say organization, of mostly Western European countries, though it has been moving east in its membership. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and so that is an economic agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico about which allows goods to be moved more easily between countries and really benefits Mexico more than anyone, but benefits Canada and Mexico and the U.S. depending on who you talk to. The OAS is the Organization of American States. The Arab League is an organization uniting many Arabic-speaking and ethnically Arab countries. And the OAU is one of the African organizations, and this one is the Organization for African Unity. And it's important to note many supranational organizations exist because of the idea that there's strength in numbers, that, for instance, a number of African nations could work together to try to bring their own countries into the forefront of the global discussion, bring their desires and attentions before the United Nations, for instance, by working together. And also, many of these do bring about a certain amount of protection. The idea that I've got your back if you've got my back if anyone were to attack us. So originally in world history, these would have just been military alliances. But as you can see, a lot of them are concerned with the economic well-being of their country and how it relates to others. Here's just a few other supranational organizations. Some of them are, like I said, more militarily minded. Some of them are just economic. Some of them are almost ideological, like the Commonwealth of Independent States. Those would be states who want to align themselves really with Russia and are communist or former communist states who see themselves as being aligned with Russia. You don't have to know these, but it's helpful to know some examples. So the big one, the United Nations, was created at the end of World War II to serve the role of a facilitator for discussions regarding international problems. The goal of the United Nations is to stop war from happening.
Mr. Cloyes.
UN membership has increased rapidly on 3 different occasions. In 1955, 16 mostly European countries joined as a result of the breakup of Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. 1960, 17 mostly former African colonies joined as they became their own independent states. And from 90 to 93, 26 countries joined as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia breaking apart for reasons we've mentioned before, and the Soviet Union breaking up, those independent republics, or those republics becoming independent states. as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. These are UN member states. I know you can't see these very well, but you can find this map in your book. It is very helpful to know which states are not in the UN. So let's take a look at that. Kosovo declared independence from Serbia in 2008, and yet it's only recognized by 56% of the countries in the UN as a sovereign state. As such, it does not have membership. The Vatican City has chosen not to join. Really, it sees no reason to, as it is largely dependent on Italy for its foreign affairs, and yet because it has such a strong connection to many parts of the world as a religious, as the religious helm of the Catholic Church, its connection to those places helps it to remain more neutral. Taiwan does not have a seat in the United Nations. That seat is granted to the People's Republic of China. Remember, there's that debate, or there was that debate, it's really not much of a debate anymore, over who the real government of China was, and Taiwan claimed to be for so long, and countries agreed that that Taiwan was, and yet now most countries agree China, the People's Republic of China, is the real government. Then there's Palestine. Palestine is seen by a country by many, but according to the UN, it is not recognized as a sovereign state. Rather, it is just an area of territory that is controlled by and within the borders of the state of Israel. Something that helps us understand really a lot about why the world is the way it is today is getting a grasp of the history of the Cold War. Now, the dates of the Cold War are debatable, but for our purposes, 1947 to 1991. So that's really kind of the rise, the heating up of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, all the way to the collapse of the Soviet Union when the Republic of Russia was reborn. The goal of the United States in the Cold War, to stop the spread of communism. This was a policy known of as containment, and it led us into fighting wars. It led us to spending billions and billions of dollars on defense and also aid for other countries. And we did this because we were worried about the domino effect. We were worried that if one state fell to communist or became communist under the influence of Russia, the state next to it eventually would, and then the state next to that one eventually would. And the theory and the fear was that communism would spread as it had, or as it seemed like it was spreading, from Russia to China, from China to Vietnam to the other Southeast Asian countries, and then to Indonesia, and then to India, and through the Middle East, and then through Africa. And the fear was the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union would be lost. And the Soviet Union would have all this power because there are all these communist states looking up to their big brother in Russia, in Moscow. And so this led to many major Cold War events. So the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fought each other, but in some ways they did in these proxy wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, these were proxy wars, meaning we didn't fight Russians, but people who we supported fought people who they supported, and we fought people who they supported. And the other examples here, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was probably the closest we got to all-out nuclear war. And I won't go into it right now, but you just need to know that it was the biggest, probably the biggest and scariest moment of a standoff between the U.S. and Russia. The space race, this was the attempt by both the U.S. and the Soviet Union to get a man into space, and then after that to get a man onto the moon. And they beat us into space, but we beat them to getting a man on the moon. And it might seem like a very unnecessary endeavor, but what the space race did is it showed the rest of the world which side was the best, which side had the best technology, which side had the strongest economy to be able to do something like this. And the symbolism of Sputnik, their satellite orbiting the Earth, was a major wake-up call to the U.S. that the Soviets were not messing around. And it was scary because it was the idea that they could have greater military strength if they could do something like this. And it made a lot of people scared. And then the United States landing a man on the moon was another pivotal moment, and the whole world was watching this happening. And it was very symbolic of the power of the United States. And you still have people, mostly guys living in their mom's basements, claiming that the moon landing never happened, that it was fake. And there are a lot of different ways that people have dispelled that myth. But the main line of thinking that makes sense to me is that if it was fake, the people telling us about that wouldn't be neckbeards who eat Stouffer's lasagna every night. It would be the Soviets. The Soviets would have proven, or at least tried to prove, that it was fake, but they never did. The Bay of Pigs invasion was another almost catastrophe, and in many ways it was still a catastrophe, where we were, through the CIA, trying to support people, rebels taking over Cuba, which was a communist and still is a communist state, which very much had a close partnership with the Soviet Union. And we were very afraid that them being so close to Florida, so close to the United States, that would be a place where Russia would be able to attack us from. And so we tried to basically bring down Fidel Castro and the communist regime from there, but failed to do so. And again, I won't go into all the history of that, but know that it was an important one. And the Berlin Wall, which we've looked at in class, was again another symbol of the Iron Curtain, that divide between the communist East and the democratic West, the divide between communism and capitalism, and the opening of that wall when it fell. And it didn't all fall all at once, but once they opened up the gates, East Berlin allowed their citizens to travel back and forth freely. That really kind of marked the end of the power of communism in the East and the end of the Cold War. The division of the world into military alliances resulted from the emergence of two superpowers. So at the end of World War II, all these nations that had been very powerful, Great Britain, Germany, they were decimated. Japan, they were really decimated by the war. They had lost everything. And so what this left was two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. We're going to talk about two Cold War military alliances in Europe. The first one is NATO, which is still around today from 1949 up until now. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There are 16 democratic states involved. Those include the U.S., Canada, and 14 other European states. So this alliance, which as you can see goes back to World War II, is one that is really intended to promote democracy and contain communism. And then the one for the communists, which really is controlled, or was controlled, I should say, by the Soviet Union and later Russia, was the military agreement among communist Eastern European countries to defend each other in case of attack. And this is created as a response to NATO. What we're going to see here is that from 1949 to 1982, NATO countries increased greatly, and while there were many countries in the Warsaw Pact in 1955, it only grew a little bit into 1956, and from then its days were really numbered. NATO and the Warsaw Pact were designed to maintain a bipolar balance of power in Europe, meaning not allowing the Western countries to have too much power and not allowing the Eastern countries to have too much power. Of course, either side would like to have all of the power, all of the influence, would like to have everyone on their side, but both of these organizations were anchored by the two superpowers, the U.S. with NATO and the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact. Of course, like I said before, NATO wanted to prevent the spread of communism, and from the perspective of the Soviet Union, the objective of the Warsaw Pact was to provide it with a buffer of allied states between it and Germany to discourage a third German invasion of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. At least that's what their talking point was. That's what they claimed. You could argue that the Soviet Union created Warsaw Pact to become the strongest force in Europe. Once Europe was no longer dominated by military confrontation between these two blocs, the Warsaw Pact disbanded. And as countries came under the influence of the West more and more compared to the East, they weren't as interested with being militarily connected to Russia. And a lot of that influence came through soft power rather than just military might. The fact that many people in Western Europe wanted to wear jeans instead of Russian-style clothing, it really said a lot and signified a lot about their intention to lean more to the West than to the East. The European Union was formed in 1958 with members Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. So again, this was when Germany was split up, the West being democratic and the East being communist. The purpose was to heal Western Europe's scars from World War II. The economies of many of these countries were decimated, and literally their cities were broken. They'd been bombed so much that this was a partnership and attempt at maybe creating a stronger economy by unifying and connecting their economies. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, also known as Comecon, not Comic Con, but Comecon, existed from 1949 to 1991 under the leadership of the Soviet Union. So the Westerners got their capitalist one, and the Soviet Union got their communist one. Those countries of the Eastern Bloc made up the members, along with a number of communist states elsewhere in the world, like Asia. And Cuba, as you can see here in this map. Red members are part of Comecon, and then yellow observers means they weren't quite members, but they were trucking with them. They were interested in what they were doing, and in some ways sympathetic, and in some ways interested in becoming members. Now, as the USSR disbanded and was dismantled, which could have happened for a number of reasons, the growing influence of the West on Eastern Europe and the faltering of the Soviet economy. For whatever reason, the USSR fell apart, and it was replaced by the CIS, which really isn't a total replacement for the Soviet Union and all of its might and expansiveness, but it was meant to be a place or a partnership for trade, financing, lawmaking, and security, and a way for Russia to still have great influence in the region and not letting all that influence fall to the United States. It was made up of 11 former USSR republics. So even though these states, these republics became their own states in Eastern Europe, they didn't just say goodbye to Russia and immediately jump to the West. There's been a consistent movement of these countries' attention from the East to the West. But there have been several Eastern Bloc countries, former Soviet republics, who are still definitely on the side of Russia and see Russia as their big brother. Now this shows the change from 1980 to 2013 politically, and the result of the disbanding of Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. The European Union expanded to 12 countries in the 1980s and then up to 27 countries in the 2000s. The main task of the EU is to promote development within member states through economic and political cooperation. So this just means it's an agreement that they're going to work together. They're going to try to promote their unified economy. Now, of course, each state has their own economy, but the idea is to have policies and laws in place that promote the overall economy of those nations that are part of the EU. The Eurozone. The European Central Bank is given responsibility of setting interest rates and minimizing inflation throughout the Eurozone. I don't expect you to understand everything about interest rates and inflation, but understand that these European countries are working together, and as it is a supranational organization, they're giving up some of their autonomy in order to try and ensure that inflation is minimal and the amount of trade that's done between the states is as much as possible. Now, this has created some trouble, because inevitably some countries are stronger economically than others. Germany has been the de facto leader of the European Union for many years and had a pretty quick recovery after the fall of the Soviet Union, after its reunification. And yet countries like Greece have done very poorly, and Spain, and these places have really kind of pulled down the rest of the EU, and so some members of the EU want them out. The common currency that's established is the euro, and it just makes business a lot easier between European countries. and it also makes it easier for you as a tourist, especially right now when the euro to dollar is still pretty good. In the past, if you're trading dollars in for euros, you're just not getting very much. And that's why it's one of the reasons why it's very expensive historically to go on a European vacation. Also, this partnership makes it pretty easy for European citizens to travel back and forth between their state and another EU state. We have to talk about terrorism, which is the systematic use of violence by a group in order to intimidate a population or coerce a government into granting its demands. So it's systematic, meaning it's calculated. It's not just somebody getting mad and hitting somebody else. It's very intentional, and it is done by a group. Now, a lot of times we use the term terrorism for whenever somebody goes on a shooting spree or blows a place up, but usually it's only considered terrorism if that person is truly associated with a group, because by associated with a group, that threat becomes bigger and more deserving of the attention of a government trying to protect its people. And notice the intent of terrorism. It's trying to intimidate a population, trying to coerce a government to granting its demands. The distinctive characteristics of terrorists include trying to achieve their objectives through organized acts of terror, viewing violence as a means of bringing widespread publicity to their cause, trying to get attention by killing a bunch of people, or believing in a cause so strongly that they attack despite knowing they will probably die in the act. Now, it's important to note that terrorism is not based on one religion or ideology. There have been Christian terrorists. If you go back and look at what's euphemistically known as the Troubles in Ireland, a huge disagreement. I really shouldn't call it a disagreement, but the fighting between Catholics and Protestants that resulted in people being shot, people being blown up by car bombs, and years and years of strife. It wasn't their religion so much that made them do that, but their cultural identity, which they based on two different branches of their religion. But in today's world, most terrorism is synonymous with radical Islam. And it is, of course, like I said, important to note that it's not necessarily religion that terrorism stems through, but the attempt of getting power and sometimes the attempt of getting revenge. But it would be foolish to say that religion doesn't have a component in that. I just think it's important that we see religion as a method of unifying people, and by unifying people, inevitably it disunifies those people from others. By grouping people together, it makes them apart from other people. And terrorism is aimed at ordinary people rather than military or political leaders. It can be considered an act of war, as the one we're about to discuss, but it is an attack that gets a lot of publicity by attacking ordinary people. And it's usually easier also to attack ordinary people than a military base or political leaders. The most famous case of terrorism in history is the attack on the World Trade Centers. In 2001, on September 11th, I saw this happen live on the second tower when I was just a kid. Of course, most of y'all were not born yet, and so it's probably hard for you to understand how radically this one event shaped our world, shaped our foreign policy, because we've been at war, even though it doesn't always seem like it, since you were born, or at least since you were a baby. And that's a big deal. There's not much more I can say on that, but just the fact that the only existence many people in this country, including most of you listening to this, has had is one where there's always fighting, there's always terrorism, there's always violence, and certainly not lost on me. For many people my age, and mostly people older, it seemed like, even though this isn't true, it seemed like the world before September 11th was a much more peaceful place, and the world after it has been one just full of one huge act of violence to the next. But it's important to note that that wasn't the first terrorist attack. Terrorist attacks, and it also wasn't the last. We are very fortunate to live in a country where we're protected by this, and live in a country where the vast majority of people here don't have reasons to carry out terrorist attacks. And since then, there have been numerous attacks across North Africa and the Middle East. Most victims of terrorist attacks are actually Muslims, because most of the terrorism is from one branch to the other, Sunni versus Shia, or Shia versus Sunni. Several Middle Eastern states have supported terrorism in recent years, and this results in some very interesting and difficult relationships between the United States and those countries supporting terrorism, because it's not always easy to prove. Now, why would a country want to support terrorism? Sometimes it can do so to kind of shake up the balance of power, whereas since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has always been the one superpower in the world. China is coming up, but they're not there yet. And terrorism is a way of kind of shaking at that, scaring the United States, scaring the supporters of the United States, and trying to get a stronghold, trying to get to a point of authority. It's almost like a way of getting there quickly. But also, supporting terrorism is a way of carrying out war in some ways without officially being recognized as doing so. So if a country like Pakistan openly said they were going to attack another country, there would be major rapid repercussions. But if they can support terrorists quietly, secretly, they can carry out some of their aims without getting in trouble for it. One way that countries have done this is providing sanctuary for terrorists wanted by other countries. So when I say sanctuary, I mean giving them a place to hide, a place to base their operations. Afghanistan and Pakistan have both done this, and this is not some Fox News talking point. If your book says it, that means it's agreed upon by the majority of people looking into this information. And even though we have seen Pakistan as an ally, they've definitely not tried very hard to squeeze out terrorists, at least in the past. Also, this can be done by supplying weapons, money, and intelligence to terrorists. So many people claim that Saudi Arabia has done this with all of their, not all of their, but much of their oil wealth, though it can't necessarily be directly proven. and by helping plan attacks and using terrorists to do so. Again, I said this is an indirect way of planning these attacks. This was Osama bin Laden's compound where he was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs, SEAL Team 6. I remember sitting in the library in college when they announced, when President Obama came on and announced that this had been done. And all these years later, it felt like retribution, that finally the man who planned and carried out the attacks on 9/11 had been brought to justice. But unfortunately, just killing one man doesn't always stop a movement, and there are still terrorist cells. And since then, the creation of ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, and the stronghold that it got in Syria, no one expected that. But it has been affirming to see ISIS being pushed back, and they are now losing the battle. So we're not going to spend more time talking about the ways in which some states have taken advantage of terrorism, because your book's gone into it and you have read it. So take another look in your book if you need to about how the governments of Libya, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq have sponsored terrorism. This is important. It's not to vilify the people who live there, as there are many good people, and I would imagine most of the people there don't want warfare. They don't want this to continue, but those in power do use terrorism, and at least have in the past used terrorism to either make a statement, to instill fear, or to get rid of people that they feel like are challenging their power. And you can read the specific examples there. That's all we got for today. Bring me any questions that you have.